Amen. Christ is risen, dear friends. Today we continue the reading of the sayings of the Desert Fathers. If you bear with me 1 second, we will pray and start. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. So we continue our celebration of Pascha, of the bright resurrection of the Lord, and that is why we sing Christ is risen as our starting prayer. And today we continue our reading with the sayings of Abba Amos. Because last time we finished Abba Achilles. So, chapter 1 of Abba Amos. It was said of Abba Amos that when he went to church, he did not allow his disciples to walk beside him, but only at a certain distance, and if the latter came to ask him about his thoughts, he would move away from him as soon as he had replied, saying to him, "It is for fear that after edifying words, irrelevant conversation should slip in, that I do not keep you with me." Now, think about the care exhibited here by Abba Amos to keep himself away from what would be called the idle talk. So, as he is walking with his disciples to church, he keeps a certain distance from him. You might say, in a funny way, he's social distancing, but he's keeping a distance so as not to chat along the way. And it is because he is concerned that irrelevant conversation would slip in, even after they talked about spiritual matters, and would take their focus away from prayer with God. And so you might say that this way, both of them could be with God, and being with God, they could be together even closer than if they had been walking along and carrying on an idle conversation. But this is the example of the zeal with which the fathers, the Desert Fathers, undertook their salvation. They tried so hard to remove even sort of the potential cause for temptation, so much so that they did things like this, which nowadays we would consider to be silly, but to them, of course, there was nothing silly about it. It was something that they did for God, for the love of God. Paragraph 2. At first, Abba Amos said to Abba Isaiah, "What do you think of me now?" He said to him, "You are an angel, Father." Later on, he said to him, "And now what do you think of me?" He replied, "You are like Satan. Even when you say a good word to me, it is like steel." So, I wonder if this Abba Isaiah was his disciple. And so, at first, maybe when Abba Isaiah came to him, and he began instructing him in the spiritual life, Abba Isaiah saw him as an angel, because, Abba Amos knew the monastic life and he knew how to pray and everything. But after a while, he said that when you say to me even a good word, it is like steel. It's hard, like steel. And this is probably the same Abba Isaiah that he kept at a distance, walking to church. So in this case, we see that even when he spoke with him, sort of with every interaction, he preserved the distance, the careful distance that they would have had, with each other, from each other, so as not to have familiarity set in. And as a matter of fact, recently, I was forced to remember what the saints talked and how they talked, that familiarity is the worst of all, because Familiarity is like the wind that just kills everything in its path. Either it's too hot and it dries everything, or it's too cold and it freezes everything. But familiarity, and you might say familiarity with a certain brazen freedom in a relationship, is extremely damaging. And so this is what Abba Amos protected himself and his disciple from. Paragraph 3. He was said of Abba Amos that illness having kept him in bed for many long years, he never allowed himself to think about his cell or look to see what it contained. For people brought him many things on account of his illness. When John, his disciple, entered or went out, he would close his eyes so as not to see what he was doing, for he knew that he was a faithful monk. So he knew that his disciple was a faithful monk, and because of that, he would close his eyes once again so as not to be distracted. So see, he did not want to be distracted by an idle conversation, and he did not want to be distracted by an idle look as well. So that is why he kept his eyes closed when his disciples went in or went out. Now, it mentions that his disciple was John, so it's possible he might have had, two different disciples, or maybe Abba Isaiah was not his disciple, but somebody who lived nearby, whom he knew. Paragraph 4. Abba Pimin said that a brother came to find Abba Amos to ask him for a word. He remained with him for 7 days without the old man answering him. Then, sending him away, the latter said to him, "Go watch yourself. As for me, my sins have become a well of darkness between me and God." So that is really something. Somebody came to seek instruction from him, and he did not offer him any instruction. So for 7 days, they just remained in silence. And after this period of 7 days, he says to him, "Go watch yourself. As for me, my sins have become a well of darkness between me and God." Now, imagine that to an ordinary person who is perhaps not skilled in spiritual life and monasticism, there are not that many sins that could be committed by a monk, especially one who is ill, who is not even leaving his cell. And so he's just staying put. But that in and of itself was a great and tremendous instruction for the visiting monk to say that when you have ceased sinning in obvious things, such as, lying or stealing or sort of doing, things that are offensive to your fellow men, when you're alone in your cell, you could still sin in your mind. And that is enough to be a dark well between you and God. Because if you indulge yourself with thoughts of pride or thinking somehow that you're better than your fellow brothers, or other various spiritual sins who are not seen, that are not seen, getting tongue-tied today. Spiritual sins that are not seen by those beside you. The visiting monk didn't see him committing any sins, but these sins could have been committed in his mind and his heart. And so that is what he said to him. Go watch yourself. So in a way, he was saying, even when you have removed yourself from any appearance of sin, you should still be vigilant. You should still be watchful and careful, because there is a lot to do within, with your spiritual life, with your heart and soul and your mind. And those sins are far more dangerous sometimes because they go on even unnoticed by us and by various people. Now, think of this in relation to the words of the Lord when he told the scribes and Pharisees. He said, "You are like beatified tombs. You're pretty on the outside, but within you're full of, dead men's bones and of every, uncleanness." And so this is what we must be careful about. And this is what he was telling this young monk to be watchful for, is when your outward life is in full accordance with the commandments of God, there is still a lot of possibility for the enemy to trip you up in various inner sins for which you must be vigilant. Paragraph 5, the last one for Abba Amos. It was said of Abba Amos that he had 50 measures of wheat for his use and had put them out in the sun. Before they were properly dried off, he saw something in that place which seemed to him to be harmful. So he said to his servants, "Let us go away from here." But they were grieved at this. Seeing their dismay, he said to them, "It is because of the loaves that you are sad? Truly, I've seen monks fleeing, leaving their whitewashed cells and also their parchments, and they did not close the doors, but went leaving them open." So what he's saying is that his disciples were perplexed about him wanting to leave the wheat behind, the bread, that he had baked and that had not dried up yet, so they wouldn't be able to carry it all with them. But he's saying that he'd seen people leave whitewashed cells behind. Now, whitewashing, in this case, I think it refers to when people used to take something lime-like, it's a particular mineral that when it's joined with water, it's kind of a rocky, clumpy, almost like hard sand or like white clay. And when they would mix it with water, it would boil, produce a gas and have a chemical reaction. It would get hot. Now, once it was cured with water, it could be put on the walls, almost like paint, and it would stay put for a while. So what he's saying is others left whitewashed cells behind without even locking doors when they found a danger for their souls nearby. By that, he's saying, not only did they build up a cell, build up a house, they had even managed to whitewash it, meaning they made it quite comfortable and even nice aesthetically to live in, and yet they were willing to leave without even closing the doors, just leaving it for anybody who would come by after them, would be able to go in, take anything they want, would actually start living there. But because they found it detrimental to their salvation, they left. So he's saying, you're sad because of the bread we're leaving behind. Others left way more than bread and left anyway because it was for their salvation, it was for their benefit. So we come to Abba Amun of Nitria. So just so you know, we had Ammonas, so like Ammoni, and then Amun. Amun and Ammonas are spelled differently in Amos. Ammonas was spelled Ammonas. Amos was spelled Ammoes, and Amun is spelled like Amoun of Nitria. So Amun, the third great founder of Egyptian monasticism, with Anthony and Pachomius. So see, he's ranked fairly high. Born in AD 295, he married. Then he and his wife lived as ascetics for 18 years. In 330, he retired to Nitria and became the first monk there. Disciples joined him and he became their leader. He died in AD, or sort of around AD 353. Paragraph 1. Abba Amun of Nitria came to see Abba Anthony and said to him, "Since my rule is stricter than yours, how is it that your name is better known amongst men than mine is?" Abba Anthony answered, "It is because I love God more than you." Now, this is quite interesting because, to an experienced person, this could really sound like a very confusing conversation, perhaps maybe even tempting, because one of them says, "My rule is stricter than yours." It can really be perceived as pride, which I assure you it was not. And the other's response, "It is because I love God more than you." That too could be perceived as proud, but it was not. These two great men were already at a very different level than any of us would probably ever be. And at that particular level, well, in colloquial English, you'd say they didn't need to beat around the bush. They said things pretty much the way they saw them. And so one said to the other, my rule is stricter. How is it that you are known more than I am? And he said, well, because I love God more than you do. So now this is very interesting because it offers a tremendous insight into a spiritual struggle and the measure of one's spiritual success. You might say a stricter rule is not an automatic guarantee of a greater love for God. Do you see what I'm saying? So someone might pray more, might fast more, might do whatever it is more than the other. But that does not necessarily mean that he loves God more than the other. Now, for those of you who might not have read the life of St. Anthony, I can tell you when St. Paul the Simple came and asked him to become a monastic under his guidance, St. Anthony put him to a test. And he kept him outside waiting for 3 days. It rained for 3 days. St. Paul stood out there in the rain for 3 days and didn't leave. St. Paul was 60 years old when he came to become a monastic. Then, when finally St. Anthony saw that he had enough resolve not to leave, St. Anthony said to him, let's pray. And they prayed for hours and hours and hours, probably 5 hours straight or more. Then St. Anthony says, okay, let's eat. So soak some beans. So while the beans are soaking, let's work. And they worked a lot for, sort of very hard. And while they worked, they also prayed. Then St. Anthony says, okay, let's eat. But before we eat, we must pray. So they prayed for a while. Let's start eating. They barely had maybe, 2 or 3 morsels of food. St. Anthony says, okay, it's time to get back to work again and to pray. And so he put St. Paul the Simple through a very, very austere test, a very strict test, which also showed that St. Anthony himself did not lead a lax way of life. He fasted a lot. He prayed a lot. He maintained his mind with God constantly at all times. You know how difficult that might be because, well, there are distractions. And of course, St. Anthony also received various people that came to see him, and he had to instruct them and pray for them and in many cases heal them or cast out the demons. So St. Anthony wasn't necessarily lax. But St. Anthony is also the one who said that I no longer fear God because I love him. So in that sense, maybe what he was trying to tell Abba Amun is that regardless of how strictly you keep your rule, you should focus on loving God, even more so than on the rule itself. And that is something that the fathers teach us. They say that fasting and prayer are never an end in and of themselves. They are means for purifying our soul from various and sundry things that separate us from God. And then they're the means for us to be united with God, to think of God, to love God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul, with all our strength. And so when we do that, then even if our rule is not as strict as someone else's, our love for God can be greater. So this is quite short and yet at the same time very interesting and edifying. Paragraph 2. It was said of Abba Amun that a very small quantity of wheat every 2 months was sufficient for him. Now he went to find Abba Pimen and said to him, when I go to my neighbor's cell, or when he comes to mine for some need or other, we are afraid of entering into conversation for fear of slipping into worldly subjects. Now remember what we read about Abba Amos and him keeping his disciple, at bay, right? So Abba Amun was also concerned about that. The old man replied, so St. Pimen the Great replied, you are right, for young men need to be watchful. Then Abba Amun continued, but the old men, what do they do? So I guess maybe because he didn't consider himself a young man at that time. Now, and of course, when But Pimen says young men, he means, sort of beginning monks, and then old men are perhaps those who have reached a certain amount of perfection, or at least who have a certain amount of experience. The old man replied, so St. Pimen the Great replied, the old men who have advanced in virtue have nothing in them that is worldly. There is nothing worldly in their mouths of which they could speak. But, Amun replied, when I am obliged to speak to my neighbor, do you prefer me to speak of the scriptures or of the sayings of the fathers? The old man answered him. So St. Pimen the Great answers him again. If you can be silent, you had better talk about the sayings of the fathers than about the scriptures. It is not so dangerous. So now, this is truly quite beautiful, and you might have wondered at some point in time, why is it that your humble servant here began with the sayings of the Desert Fathers and not with the commentaries on the scriptures? And in general, those of you who have attended our youth group meetings, the Theology youth group meetings in Toronto, that are taking place in Russian, over the period of about 6 years, the only scripture that we read, the commentaries to, was the book of Psalms, and that was because that was, that was the 12th century commentary, I think. So the writer, it's slipping my mind. I'm thinking of the name. Euthemius Zigabin, he was the one that wrote the commentary, and of course he compiled the Father's sayings about the book of Psalms. So St. Pimen the Great tells Abba Amun, if you can't be silent when someone comes to visit you, it is safer for you to talk about the sayings of the Fathers because they're more explanatory, and they also refer very often to the practical way of life, to the practical acquisition of virtue, not so much to theology, where in the scriptures you may need to touch theology, and theology is a very, you could say it is a dangerous subject, because if you go down the wrong path and there is no one near you to stop you, and say you embrace a view which is not accepted by the church, which is not accepted by the Holy Fathers, if that view is rooted in your soul, you could find yourself leaving the church and being separated from God because of heresy that you have found comfortable and nice and acceptable in your own mind, and you are not willing to set aside for the sake of being united with the church. So in that sense, we must be extremely careful not to venture into commentary of the Holy Scriptures too freely. Many, 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 many years ago, well over 20 years ago, in our parish in Atlanta, we read the commentaries of Blessed Theophylact on the Holy Scriptures, and the rector asked me to prepare sort of the very first sermon of St. John Chrysostom on the Gospel of St. Matthew. That's where we started. So, that's what we did. Blessed Theophylact lived in the 10th and the 11th century, I think, sort of maybe somewhere, in between the two centuries. And of course, St. John Chrysostom is a 4th century, I think 4th century saint. So we refer to St. John Chrysostom just to give a certain perspective to our parishioners, and how amazed and impressed we were that as early as 4th century, St. John Chrysostom commenting on certain scriptures, in the Gospel of St. Matthew, actually said, this is not my own explanation. This is something that I've inherited from the Holy Fathers. This is what is taught by all the fathers of the church. And so in that sense, we must be very, very, very careful and cautious not to approach the understanding and commenting of the Holy Scriptures with with familiarity and impudence, I might say. You know, we should read the scriptures daily, but if there is anything that we do not understand, definitely, first and foremost, refer to the Holy Fathers who have explained it, who commented. Speak to your spiritual father or to your parish priest. Ask first counsel. Don't just go making up your own, sort of commentary. Now, someone writes, sometimes it's difficult to stay concentrated during the prayer. Does it mean it won't work? Now, to that, I will give you this response. Sometimes we do certain things that we have to do every day, and one day we do a little better, the other day we do maybe not as good of a job. But the most important thing is that we persevere and we continue doing. If we say, well, it doesn't work, so I'll stop doing, which means we would stop praying and we would never pray again. So a prayer, St. Ignatius Brencheninov, the wonderful Russian monastic saint, who was a very brilliant person, with a very promising career, and he set everything aside for the sake of Christ and became a monk and became a bishop eventually. Then he, I think, lived in retirement a certain amount of time of his life, and then in his retirement he wrote a number of wonderful, wonderful and very edifying books. So St. Ignatius says quite clearly, attention is the soul of prayer. Prayer without attention is dead. Now, which one of us would dare to say that during the divine service or even during our daily prayers at home, we pay 100% of attention? I don't think anyone would say that we do. It's very difficult to stay focused. Yes, outside interference, our own thoughts, sort of in our minds, distract us. They take us away from prayer, and we're, sadly, we're sort of not paying attention. But if anything, prayer that has less attention than we want it to have, prayer that has less attention that maybe it should have, is still good in the sense that it is like a chain, chain. It's a link. Yes, it's a weaker link, but still it links together maybe the prayer that we offered yesterday that had a little more attention, and the prayer that will come tomorrow that would have, hopefully, more attention. So in that sense, it is beneficial. Think of it this way. If someone has a habit of looking for treasure, everywhere he goes, will that person find treasure? Maybe not for many, 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 and many years. But at some point in time, that person might actually come across something that's quite valuable because of his habit of looking for treasure. Now, if we have a habit of praying, even when we're not paying attention, at least by establishing this habit, we are, you might say, building the body that the soul could then animate, that the soul can make alive. And so if we are preserving the body, if we're keeping the body, then when the attention comes, that body will be alive. So in that sense, definitely, even if we find ourselves lacking attention in prayer, we should never stop, because even that prayer brings benefit compared to no prayer. Now, can it become detrimental? Yes. If we don't make an effort to pay attention, if we don't even try to gain the experience of being attentive in prayer, if we become pharisaical and simply say, well, I did from A to Z today, I'm good, everything's fine, and we don't make an effort, then of course it will be bad. Then it will not be so useful. But if we are constantly trying, then one day we will succeed. God will give it to us. And in fact, the scripture says that God gives prayer to the one who is praying. So you might say that prayer with attention is a gift from God, but God will only give it to the one who is praying and trying to pray with attention, trying to make that effort. If someone is not praying at all, why would God give him that gift? there's no sense in doing it whatsoever at all. So in that sense, yes, even when we are straying from attention, we should still seek to have prayer on a regular basis. Prayer that, like water, slowly dripping on the stone, will actually carve it. Paragraph 3, the last one for Abba Amun. A brother came to Setis to see Abba Amun and said to him, "My father is sending me out on an errand, but I'm afraid of fornication." The old man answered, "Whatever the hour when the temptation comes upon you, say, 'God of all virtue, by the prayers of my father, save me from it.'" So one day when a young girl closed the door upon him and began to cry out with all his might, "God of my father, save me," and immediately he found himself on the road to Setis. So this is more than just a saying of the fathers. It's actually something that's quite beautiful, because one younger monk comes to Abba Amun and says that his elder is sending him on an errand, but he's afraid, of falling into sin. Abba Amun gives him counsel and says, well, when you're, fulfilling your obedience, if you are tempted, pray, and, by the prayers of my father, save me. So when it in fact happened to the monk that the young woman closed the door behind him, and what that means basically is she led him into the house and closed the door, attempting to, sort of seduce him, he cried out and prayed, "O God of all virtue, for the sake of the prayers of my father, save me," and found himself on the road to Setis. So God physically transported him. And so in that sense, we could say that if ever someone who is in authority over us, is telling us to do something that we are not certain about, well, the errand in and of itself was not to commit fornication. The errand most likely was to sell the baskets that they've weaved together, or, maybe to buy more materials for weaving baskets. So there was no, there was no, evident sin in the errand itself. The temptation came while he was doing the errand, and God spared him. So when someone in authority over us tells us to do something that we know might have a certain amount of danger connected with it, perhaps maybe there could be a temptation associated with it, as long as the request itself is not sinful. If we're not sent to steal something, if we're not sent to, lie about something, if we're sent to do something and we get tempted while we're trying to execute, our obedience, then by all means we should pray to God, and God will save us because we are obedient and we are doing what we were asked. Abba Anub is a different say. So Anoub. Anub was one of the 7 brothers of Pimen, whose sayings occupy a large place in the Apophthegmata. So I guess that's, the sayings of the fathers. 3 of the brothers, Anub, Paisius, and Pimen, lived together at first in Setis, with Pimen as their leader. After the first devastation of Setis, in about 407 or 8 AD, they went with their brothers to Teraneuthis, where they decided to stay together and live the Cenobitic life. So the Cenobitic life, as opposed to the anchorite life or the eremitic life. Eremitic life or anchorite life is the life in the desert, and the life, anchorite is like a recluse, somebody who lived alone. Cenobium is sort of a mutual dwelling of monks. So Cenobitic monastery would be the monastery like Holy Trinity St. Sergius Lavra, would be like the Jordanville Holy Trinity Monastery. Those are the Cenobitic monasteries where the brothers live and they share everything in common. So, and Anub taken charge of the Cenobitic life. That's quite interesting. So they sort of changed leadership from time to time. The devastation of Setis marks a turning point in the history of early monasticism in Egypt. The monks dispersed, and gradually the center shifted from Egypt to Palestine. This story of Anub and his brothers indicates a new reason for the formation of Cenobitic communities, that is, protection against invaders. So when the monks were living as anchorites and sort of the eremitic way of life, they were living alone. They had no wall around the monastery. They had absolutely no protection. So in that sense, they were an easy target for the brigands and robbers and the various sort of ill-intended individuals in the Cenobitic monasteries. Like, for example, Mount Athos, the 20 great monasteries are Cenobitic. And then they also have monasteries, where they have various skeets and sort of places where monastics can live the eremitic and anchorite way of life on Mount Athos. But the Cenobitic monasteries there, they all have walls, they all have gates. And the reason for that, of course, is because, yes, they often were attacked by pirates who would, come ashore of Mount Athos and then, try to sort of rob a monastery and, of course, kill monks and do horrible things to them and then imprison them and make them slaves, for profit to sell them. So because of that, I guess the monastics united and they started living together. So there are only two paragraphs. One is very large and one is very small. Paragraph 1 of Abba Anub. Abba John said of Abba Anub and Abba Pimen and the rest of their brethren who come from the same womb and were made monks in Setis, that when the barbarians came and laid waste that district for the first time, they left for a place called Ternuthis until they decided where to settle. They stayed in an old temple several days, so a pagan temple. Then Abba Anub said to Abba Pimen, "For love's sake, do this. Let each of us live in quietness, each one by himself, without meeting one another for the whole week." Abba Pimen replied, "We will do as you wish." So they did this. Now there was in the temple a statue of stone. When he woke up in the morning, Abba Anub threw stones at the face of the statue. And in the evening he said to it, "Forgive me." During the whole week he did this. On Saturday they came together, and Abba Pimen said to Abba Anub, "Abba, I have seen you during the whole week throwing stones at the face of the statue and kneeling to ask it to forgive you. Does a believer act thus?" The old man answered him, "I did this for your sake. When you saw me throwing stones at the face of the statue, did it speak or did it become angry?" Abba Pimen said, "No." Or again, when I bent down in penitence, was it moved, and did it say, "I will not forgive you"? Abba Pimen said, "No." Then the old man resumed, "Now we are 7 brothers. If you wish us to live together, let us be like the statue, which is not moved, whether one beats it or whether one flatters it. If you do not wish to become like this, there are 4 doors here in the temple. Let each one go where he will." Then the brethren prostrated themselves and said to Abba Anub, "We will do as you wish, Father, and we will listen to what you say to us." Abba Pimen added, "Let us live together to the rest of our time, working according to the word which the old man has given us." He made one of them housekeeper, and all that he brought them they ate, and none of them had the authority to say, "Bring us something else another time," or perhaps, "We do not want to eat this." Thus they passed all their time in quietness and peace. And so this is a very interesting and very edifying story. There is another similar circumstance where a young monk came to an older saint and asked to become his disciple, and the elder said, "I will, with one condition. You do as I say, and then afterward we'll see whether I will accept you or not." So the young monk said, "What is it that you want me to do, Father?" The old monk says, "Go to the cemetery and curse the dead." He says, "Whoa, how is that?" He says, "Do as I say." So he went to the cemetery and he cursed the dead, and he said all horrible things to the dead and sort of, abused them verbally. Then the elder says to him, "Now, next day, go and praise the dead and say all sorts of wonderful things to the dead." So the young monk went and he did that, and he flattered them and he praised them and he said all sorts of wonderful things to them. Then he came back and he said, "Abba, but I don't understand. Why did you have me do this?" And so the elderly monk said, "When you cursed the dead, did they curse back? Did they say anything back to you?" And he said, "No." He said, "And then the next day when you praised them and you flattered them, did they respond in any way?" And he said, "No." So the old man says, if you could be like the dead, then you may stay and become my disciple. And so this story explains why so great saints as Saint Pimen and Paisius, the brothers of Abba Anub, chose him to be their abbot, because he gave them that example of dispassion, using a statue, a pagan statue at that, that he threw stones at, and then he prostrated before, asking forgiveness, and it responded, equally the same, right? So he said, if we could be like this, then we could live together. Otherwise, let us leave. Let everybody go where he wants. So that is very edifying. And I dare say that at some point in time, we must become the same, like that statue in the church. Because there will be times when people will be praising us in the church, and there will be times when people will be slandering us in the church. And unless we can remain in the church unmoved as that pagan statue, we will suffer damage. Because both praise and slander equally can separate us from God. One might sort of, you might say, make us feel conceited and proud, and that when we're praised we might sort of get too comfortable, and it will undermine our efforts towards salvation. And slander can definitely embitter us, make us angry, make us vengeful, and thus also separate us from God. So both of those things separate us from God, praise and slander. So in order to stay united with God, we must be like the dead, we must be like that statue, and we must be then like Abba Anub and his brothers, like the 7 of them. Paragraph 2. Abba Anub said, since the day when the name of Christ was invoked upon me, no lie has come out of my mouth. So essentially since the day of his baptism then, right? Or him becoming a catechumen. That is when the name of Christ would have been invoked upon him. So that is extremely impressive and very precious. Of course, that is something that all of us must strive for. We must do our best. We must struggle with all our strength, with all our soul, with all our might, to love God and to abstain from all manner of sin, and of course from lying, because lying is a terrible sin. You say a small lie, then you have to sort of cover for that lie, which means another lie, and yet another, and another, and another, and before you know it, you're in a whole sort of sea of lies, or in a deep well of lies. And then it's truly like that deep well that Abba Emo said, like it's a well that separates me from God, a dark and deep well. So let us make all efforts to love each other and not to lie, either by being silent, or we should not lie with our deeds, we should not lie with our silence, we should definitely not lie with our speech. We should honor God with our entire lives. As St. Paul teaches, whether you sleep or you keep vigil, whether you eat or you fast, do all things for the glory of God. So everything that we do, we must do for the glory of God, because we must remember those who cast out devils, healed the sick, and raised the dead, and they didn't do it for the glory of God. They didn't do it because God wanted them to do it. They did it in the name of God, but for whatever their own reasons and devices, they did not inherit the kingdom of God. That is something that's very sobering and scary in a way, you'd say, that we should keep in mind. And so let us emulate. We don't have to imitate directly, but let us emulate the Holy Fathers. And today's example of Abba Anub and his brothers is really quite valuable. We should try to be dispassionate. Now, of course, when your close ones thank you, or they say something kind to you, and you want to express some gratitude, some kindness, some sort of good emotion, yes, you should. But overall, really, and especially within, even when outwardly we perhaps express our pleasure or displeasure in some cases, but inwardly we must be like that statue of Abba Amun in the pagan temple, the statue that he used as an example of how we should live with our brothers. Should we ask God help in making good deeds? Not should, we must. We must always ask God to help us in everything. From the very first sort of time when we open our eyes in the morning, we should be asking God for help, and closing our eyes to rest for sleep. We should also ask God for help even during sleep, when we are asleep, and certainly when we are attempting to do good deeds. God bless all of you. We will continue, God willing, next week. I will announce it once again, as I did today, probably in the sort of earlier time of the day. If you would like for me to make the announcement about the broadcast a day or 2 days earlier, I should be able to do that. Maybe write me directly, those of you who know how to reach me. I would try to sort of make that adjustment. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. Христос воскресе из мертвых, смертью смерть поправ, и сущим во гробех живот даровав. Христос анести эк некрон, θάνατον πατήσας και της εν της μνήμασι ζωήν χαρισάμενος. So those of you who know the Greek chant, perhaps maybe it's not exactly as it is written, do forgive me. Please pray for me, a sinner, and God willing, we'll see you again next week. Christ is risen. Christos воскресе. Christos anesti. God bless you all.